Thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to give it about just another minute or so, maybe a little less, just to allow people some time to join the webinar, and then we'll get started. Okay, we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome everyone to today's webinar on Language Matters, exploring the impacts of how we talk about race. Part one of a three-part series on understanding racial injustice and its impact on student mental health. We're very happy to have you here with us today. This webinar is being sponsored by the Northeast and Caribbean Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC, in collaboration with the with the National Hispanic and Latino, MHTTC, try and get all the words right here. The Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC is housed at Rutgers School of Health Professions, Department of Psychiatric Rehabilitation, and the National Center for Hispanic and Latino, MHTTC, is housed at the Universidad del Caribe. I'll ask Dr. Romero to correct me here in a minute. And we're happy to offer this in partnership. My name is Ann Murphy, and I'm the director of the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC, and I'll be helping to facilitate the webinar today. The MHTTCs are funded by SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, to enhance the capacity of the behavioral health workforce and other related workforces, including our K-12 educators, to deliver evidence-based and empirically supported practices to individuals with mental health conditions. We encourage you to visit the MHTTC Network website for additional information at mhttcnetwork.org, and there you can go to Find My Center and click on any of the regional centers as well as the national centers. We do want to encourage you, if you want to keep in touch with other offerings that we provide, to subscribe to receive our mailings at the bit.ly link that's available on the screen. We did also want to mention the next two webinars in this series, one on August 6th, also at 1 o'clock. That'll be focused on trauma, barriers, and behaviors. The role of race, and the third one on August 13th on culturally responsive strategies to promote student success. We hope you can join us for those. We do want to make sure that you know that we're interested in collecting your feedback and your input. Our funding does come from SAMHSA, as I mentioned, and they require us to evaluate our services. And so as part of that process, we ask you to complete a very brief, really only about 1 to 2 minute long anonymous survey that you'll be redirected to at the end of this webinar. We'd really appreciate you completing it and providing us with that input. So we hope that you'll take an extra minute at the end to do that. We did also want to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, and following the conclusion of the webinar, we'll post this recording as well as the presenter slides on our website, and as well as the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC. We did want to let you know that we encourage your participation in the webinar and your interactions with the presenters. You can utilize the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you want to type in a question as we go. I do want to let you know that those Q&A questions are visible to both the presenters and the other attendees. You can also communicate with us through the chat function, and you have control over who's able to view that. You can change using the drop-down arrow so that only the presenters and panelists can see your comments, or you can modify it to be visible to all attendees as well. So please feel free to utilize that to both share comments throughout the presentation and to type in questions that you have that we'll present to the presenters at the end in the time that we have left. I do want to review this disclaimer. The presentation that's prepared for the MHTTC is done under a cooperative agreement from SAMHSA. All material appearing in this presentation is in the public domain and can be reproduced or copied without permission from SAMHSA or the authors. We do appreciate a citation. We do ask that you not reproduce or distribute the presentation for a fee, as all of our offerings should be available at no cost. This presentation is being recorded, as I mentioned, and will be posted on our website. And at this time, Dr. Eleanor McCants-Katz is serving as the SAMHSA Assistant Secretary, and we want to be clear that the opinions expressed herein are the views of the presenters and do not reflect any official position of the Department of Health and Human Services or SAMHSA. And I will turn it over to my colleague, PJ Wanger, first to orient us to today's presentation and introduce our two wonderful presenters. PJ?
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar in our webinar series at the intersection of race, of students' mental health. So our goal through the presentation of this series is to explore the language we use in relation to marginalized populations and how social injustice relates to trauma, adverse events, and mental health concerns. Our intention is to provide some insight into how that experience may manifest in the behavior we are seeing in our students. We will look at strategies that educators and counselors can utilize in schools when working with students to mitigate barriers and support future success. The strategies will also look at facilitating culturally responsive support for students' mental health and how we can utilize strategies to avoid reinforcing stigmatizing beliefs and contribute to our students' overall well-being. I encourage you to participate in our following two webinars. Anne had already given you the dates. The second webinar will be Trauma, Barriers, and Behaviors, the Role of Race, where we will explore the experiences of trauma among marginalized groups and the behavioral manifestations of trauma you may see among students, as well as the barriers impacting life trajectory and seeking mental health supports. And our final webinar in the series, Culturally Responsive Strategies to Promote Student Wellness, will examine and provide strategies to facilitate culturally responsive supports for students' mental health and affirming approaches that capitalize on our students' strengths and avoid reinforcing stigmatizing behavior and beliefs. So our first speaker I'm very excited to introduce is Kimmy Carlos. Kimmy is the founder of the Urban Mental Health Alliance, advocating for healthy minds in urban communities. She is the CEO and founder of Kimmy Carlos Motivational Consulting and co-founder and lead facilitator of Sister Wellness Retreats, healing spaces for Black women. Kimmy is also a certified health and wellness coach with the Institute for Integrative Nutrition, a certified instructor for mental health, first aid, and a trained anti-racism trainer with the Episcopal Diocese of New Jersey. Kimmy is the author of published book, The Window of Grace, Living in Recovery Through Christian Faith. So Kimmy, I'm going to let you take over and I will introduce Dr. Romero when you are done.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. I want to thank MHTTC and Anne and PJ. And again, I want to reiterate that I'm delighted to be able to speak alongside of Dr. Romero. It's a pleasure to be able to have this conversation around language because I think it's so important. So PJ, I'm going to assume that you're going to advance the slides for me.
I believe Anne is going to advance the slides for you.
Anne's going to advance the slides. Okay, thank you so much. Just want to make sure we have our logistics together. So today I'm going to talk about language, race, and the dehumanization of people and how important it is to understand how deeply language intersects with race and racism and how that affects populations of people, not just in race, but also in ethnicity and in culture. So let me just put the be transparent. I'm not a linguist, but I am going to speak a lot about the language that we use in communities, and I'm going to share a lot about lived experience. So I want to talk first about the power that our words have, right? When you think about how words come out of our mouths, that is literally energy that is coming out of our mouths, right? And those words actually have the opportunity to change the trajectories around us. We can use our words to affirm, we can use our words to uplift, we can also use our words to oppress, right? We have had the opportunity to sit under preachers and leaders of faith who have empowered us and who have brought us to new levels in spirituality. And we've also had the opportunity to sit under people that were discouraging and have had an opportunity to really shift the mood in our spirit, right? We know that the tongue can be a mighty thing. And so we want to have a conversation around how language actually affects not just everybody, but our most marginalized communities, right? So I'm going to use the phrase Black, Indigenous, and people of color often. And towards the end of my 30 minutes, we're going to delve into a little bit about what that phrase means and why it's so important. So I'm going to read a quote that for me is really hard, but it speaks exactly to what I'm getting ready to share. This quote was by journalist Radley Balco, journalist on Twitter. And it reads, "It isn't easy for a man to rip a screaming child away from his mother. Most of us couldn't do it. This is where animals, quote unquote, comes in. Declare he isn't really a child. She isn't a woman. Now it's like pulling a piglet from a sow. This has always been how states enable savagery." And this journalist is actually speaking to the American policy of separating families at the border and how that policy was coming to light. Now, this is not a political conversation, but it speaks to how language has really shaped that situation. So, Anne, if you'll advance to the next slide. I want to talk about what dehumanization means. It means one group denies the humanity of the other group. Members of a group are equated with animals, vermin, insects, or diseases. Dehumanization overcomes the normal human revulsion against murder. Hate propaganda in print and on hate radios is used to vilify the victim. So let me unpack this a little bit in terms of how language works. We all innately have what I call a center of goodness, or a moral center, if you will, right? Where our conscious kind of guides us in the way of knowing what's right and what's wrong, in conjunction with what we've been taught in our culture, whatever that culture is, right? So we've been taught morals, what's correct, what's not correct, how to behave, how not to behave, right? And we know that do unto others, you know, as you would have others do unto you, is kind of like the golden rule, right? But when you work hard to remove the equality of humanity among you, it becomes a lot easier to see them as less than, right? So let me go a step further. If you think about the founding of the United States and the first nation people who were here, right? Our indigenous population that was on this land, right? Before it became the United States. And if you think about the sanctioned genocide that went on in order to establish this country, right? There had to be a mindset to be able to do that and still be able to live with your center of goodness, right? If you also think in terms of the enslavement of African and African Americans in this country to literally kidnap human beings and bring them across the ocean, right? And own them, quote unquote, and sell them as chattel, right? And to view them as property, right? You have to shift the way you view African and African American humanity in order to allow your conscience to be able to do this, right? And all of that starts with language and the way we speak to our fellow humanity, right? And when I say speak to, I mean the way we address them, right? And so we have a lot of words in our culture that we use sometimes directly, sometimes indirectly, sometimes consciously, sometimes not so consciously, right? That has a way of marginalizing not just people, but communities and families and races and ethnicities and faiths and cultures, right? And we're often not aware of it. So I want to just kind of unpack some of those words. So Anne, if you would advance to the next slide for me. So I want to look at some of the words that we often use in our American language that's really kind of like everyday, right? So I want to start with the word Negro, which has never really been deemed a bad word, quote unquote. We kind of look at it as being outdated, right? But the truth is that language, Negro and Caucasian, came out of the belief, the quote unquote junk science, if you will, that somehow African and African American humanity was less than or subpar, right? And so it was used to kind of distinguish Black humanity away from other humanity, right? Now, I want to delve into that a little further. After we got past Negro, we started using the word colored, and you'll note that that didn't last very long, right? One of the reasons that colored kind of fell out of favor with African and African Americans is because it does a great job of otherizing white, right? If you think about the word colored, it's a past tense, it's an adjective, right? So it implies that somehow people of color are not in their natural state, right? Or they're not in the correct state. They've been colored, right? They've been altered in some way so that they are somehow unnatural, right? Which is very different from saying a person of color. So a person who lives in skin that has a color to it, right? And so that's just an example of how we use language that directly and indirectly begins to minimize a person or marginalize a person as a human being, right? And then the word minority actually has some real strong connotations as well, because it started as a phrase that came out of the census, right? And it was looking at the numbers of the populations of people. And so African and African Americans and our Latino brothers and sisters were in the minority for a lot of years when it came to numbers based on the census, right? And so it was used as the majority, you know, being white, and the minority being people of color. But that word became very mainstream, right? And so now when people are talking about someone other than white folks, we use the word minority, which again connotates everything being less than, right? This person is now less than what the majority is, right? Another word that we use quite freely, even more now, because we are having a reckoning in this country around systemic racism and the stain of enslavement in this country. So we're talking a lot about quote unquote slaves, right? And that's something that I think we're still kind of wrapping our heads around what's the best way to engage in this conversation in affirming ways, because how do you have this conversation, you know, around such an atrocity in our history in an affirming way? But it's important to understand, again, that when you tell a group of people, a population of people, a race, a culture of people, that they are descendants of slaves, right, as opposed to them being descendants of human beings, again, that's another way of marginalizing or minimizing this person's humanity, right? So instead of the word slave, we speak about our ancestors who have been enslaved, right? So we did not bring, as a country, we didn't bring slaves from Africa. We brought Africans from Africa and we enslaved their humanity, right? And so hopefully this is starting to take shape, the way we begin to dehumanize people, right? And we know, again, that this really comes from a place of moral center. If you are going to allow yourself to violate and brutalize and minimize or marginalize or oppress a group of people, you have to first believe that they are different from you, less than you, other than you, right? So if we think about things like invaders, right? And we're seeing a lot of that around our Latino brothers and sisters that are coming from the South, right? And we know for a fact that these are mothers and fathers and children and grandparents, right? Who are trying to find a better life for themselves, right? And again, this is not a political conversation, but just putting context around how these words are being used, right? So again, instead of referring to people as human beings, right, and recognizing this Latino humanity that's coming from the South and coming into this country, seeking a better life as most of the ancestors did when they came to this country, right? They're viewed as invaders. They're invading the country, right? And if you also think in terms of the word illegal, these are illegals, right? Which is why, again, when you start to build affirming language, we're beginning to move away from invaders and illegals to the undocumented, right? These are still human beings who are crossing the border seeking some sort of relief, right, from the oppression that they're experiencing, or the violence or the brutality that they're experiencing, or the severe poverty that they're experiencing in their own countries, right? Again, we kind of shaped them, going back to that quote we had previously. We shaped the way that the country views this population of people, and it makes it easier for someone to literally rip a child from the arms of a parent, kidnap a child from the arms of a parent, right, and put this child in a different system, or to put families behind cages, right, or to assume that because they came across the border illegally, that they don't need proper preventive hygiene and healthcare to make sure that they don't get COVID-19, right? If you phrase it a certain way, then people become viewed as less than, right? If you think about the way we talk about our indigenous population, right? Our First Nation population, or often called First People, right? Who were first on this land before the United States became the United States, right? And all the language that was used and is still used in order to address them, right? If you think about like the language of redskin, which is so popular right now because everyone's having a conversation about the Washington Redskins, right? And how important it was to change that name, because it was such a derogatory term, right? It's equivalent to, you know, when we said things like, you know, yellow people, or when we said things like red people, or if we said things like, you know, Negro people, right? It's equivalent to the same thing. It's what you would call a slur, right? And the fact that this was in mainstream for so long, and that we are only beginning to have this reckoning, again, speaks to how dehumanization works. I want to just touch on a few others I think that's really important. You want to pay attention to the way language is used in media, right? So not just everyday language, you and I, but language that's used in the media, and the way certain cultures, certain races, certain ethnicities are portrayed in the media, right? And so one of the circumstances that's most glaring is when we look at how we deal with young Black males versus young white males, right? And we've seen time and time again the tragedy, the atrocity of mass shootings. And those mass shootings are usually, not always, but usually perpetrated by young white men, right? Who, for whatever reason, have become disillusioned or have become mentally ill, right? And have literally used gun violence, right, to commit mass murder, okay? And when we hear that in the news, there's always a lot of grace and background given around, why this action was chosen, why this young man, may have become disillusioned or may have suddenly become violent. And we talk about, them being misguided or dealing with a mental illness or having been bullied, right? And all of that is legitimate. It absolutely is. It is in no way an excuse for such atrocities, but it is absolutely legitimate, right? But when we look at the way young Black males or young brown males, right, are portrayed in the media, when they also commit violent acts, right, gunfire, usually it's in their local communities, right, that this happens. Then we hear words on a national level, on a local level, like thug or savage, right, or animal, right? And literally they become no longer human, right? And so these kinds of words gives not only people, but systems and infrastructures permission. It emboldens them to treat people with violence and brutality as if there were nothing more than, a bug being stepped on, right? So again, I'm speaking from the lived experience and the way that people of color recognize the language, okay? And if you go to the next slide for me. This slide is pretty intense, and I apologize because it's so tiny. I tried to blow it up as best I could, but I wanted to just give some examples around how language plays out, right? The way that people use language, often not recognizing the way this language sounds, right? So I'm gonna look at my second screen only because it's a little bigger. So if you'll just bear with me here, because I wanna just be able to actually show this language a little larger, because I want to literally read to you some of these quotes. So when we use language that dehumanizes, I want to talk about some of the quotes that have come from some very prominent people and very prominent institutions around African Americans, our indigenous population, our European Jews, as well as our refugees, and our incarcerated, which we know is disproportionately Black and brown. So these quotes are pretty intense, and I'm going to pick some of the lighter ones to just kind of give an example. So Dr. E.T. Brady in 1909, "The Negroes are parasites." The U.S. Supreme Court, 1857, "A Negro was regarded as an article of property." The Virginia Supreme Court, 1858, "In the eyes of the law, the slave is not a person." Professor Charles Carroll, 1900, "The Negro is one of the lower animals." In terms of Native Americans, indigenous population, First Nation, "The Indian is an untamable carnivorous animal." Dr. J. Knott, 1847. "Clear the country of that vermin." Colonel Banquet, 1763. "An Indian is not a person within the Constitution of American law." And that is 1881. And then just some others when we speak to our Jewish brothers and sisters, "The Jew is a parasite." This was actually a quote out of a Nazi booklet. Transit material, portrayal of Jews sent to death Nazi camps, right? The prisoners here are animals, right? So it gives you an idea of how language is often used and how it becomes normalized. Now, we don't hear such blatant dehumanizing language as much anymore today, but the belief around the minimization of humanity in people of color in marginalized communities continues to get passed down through the generations, because this is what has been taught both directly and indirectly, right? So if you think about the fact that our president of the country has been known, right, to literally call Black women dogs. And I don't know that you can dehumanize a person any more than to call them a dog, right? And when that comes from such a high place in a country, right, from such a prominent pedestal, what you're doing is you are validating the belief, right, that women of color are somehow less than human. They are otherized, right? When you think about the way we refer to Black children, right? We have a tendency to adultify Black children, right? So when Black children are having any type of emotional problems, behavioral problems, right? They're not viewed as children. They're viewed as adults. They're viewed as adults in the educational system. They're viewed as adults in the justice system, right? And but we have a tendency to infantilize, if that's a correct word, adult Black men and women and adult brown men and women, right? We portray in this country Black and brown people as violent, as unintelligent, right? And as inhuman, right? And we do this with the words and the language that we use and the way we use it, right? So I had to have my own learning experience in wrapping up, and had to recognize I had to recognize all the ways in which I have been discriminatory and have dehumanized our First Nation people simply by the phrases that I grew up using, right? I grew up watching country westerns, right? As a kid, as most of us did in the 50s and 60s and 70s, right? And so I viewed, our First Nation indigenous people as the bad guy, right? Because that's what we saw, right? So I saw them as redskins. I saw them as savages, right? And so I used phrases like screaming like a banshee, or I used phrases like, Indian giver, right? Not realizing how dehumanizing these words are, and that I am otherizing an entire culture or race, if you will, of people, right? And one of the most humiliating experiences for me was taking a 3-day anti-racism training course that was so eye-opening that I actually went on to get certified to become an anti-racist trainer. Was recognizing and understanding the sacred land upon which this country has been built, right? And the genocide of our First Nation people, and understanding the privilege that I have, right, of going to school, getting married, raising a family, buying a house, having a career, driving my car, right, on land that people were literally, slaughtered for, right? And I had to realize all the ways that I've been complicit in dehumanizing our first people because of a lack of knowledge and because there's been a socialization. I want to speak real quickly before I wrap up to the fact that I do understand that there's a difference between intent and impact, right? And often, as someone literally just said to me yesterday, a colleague yesterday, who wanted to have a really tough conversation with me around a social justice issue. And he said to me, please hear my heart because I might not say this properly, right? So often our intent is good, right? Or our intent has no malice, right? But we have to learn to think beyond intent and think about impact. And how do our words and our language impact? How does that land on this humanity that is in front of me, right? And when we come from that place and think about how we engage verbally with humanity, regardless of what color, what race, what ethnicity, right? What faith, right? What nationality, this is still humanity in front of us. So if we think about how we've been socialized, right, to use certain language and to view certain cultures, right? But if we shift that and we think about how does what I'm getting ready to say, my intent, how is that going to land? How is that going to impact this human being in front of me? Because what happens is when we impact people, we also impact their families, their community, their circle of influence, right? Someone asked me once, they said, how can gang members in inner cities kill their own brothers and sisters? How do you kill the people in your own communities? How do you use gang warfare and gun violence to literally slaughter people that live in the same community as you. And it's important to understand that this is not because people of color, namely young Black boys, are any less human, but it's because they have been dehumanized in the eyes of this country. They've been taught that anything that looks like them, walks like them, talks like them is less than, right? And when you have that sense of internalized inferiority, then to perpetrate violence against someone who looks like you is natural, right? That's another way that we dehumanize not only that individual, but everything that's around that individual. And next slide, please. So I want to just end by talking about how important it is to understand what dehumanization does, right? Because there's the impact of the language that we use is so far beyond the person just being offended in that moment when they hear it, right? So this quote I really love. It says, dehumanization, although a concrete historical fact, right? So we have evidence around what dehumanization looks like through language, is not a given destiny, which means this is not what we have to do. This is not the place we need to get to or the place we need to be. But it's the result of an unjust order that engenders violence in the oppressor, right? So that unjust order is the belief in a superior and an inferior race of people, right? That unjust order that we have literally built this country upon, right? It engenders violence in the oppressor because the oppressor has dehumanized the oppressed, right? Which in turn dehumanizes the oppressed. So it becomes a vicious cycle where we are not only dehumanizing with what we say in the language that we use and the way that language socializes the country to view marginalized Black and brown humanity, but then we in turn empower people to be violent, to be brutal towards those who are marginalized, which further dehumanizes them. So again, from the point of a lived experience, I think the greatest thing that I could possibly say is not only is language powerful, but it's one of the easiest things that we can change, that we have control over. It's a matter of how we view the humanity in front of us. How do we use words to impact that humanity, and whether the words that we use are affirming and uplifting, or whether those words that we use are oppressive and dehumanizing. And I'm extremely grateful just to be able to come to the table and have this conversation. And as my father, Dr. John Carlos says, 1968 Olympian, he says, how do you expect the people to live in the world and not have something to say about injustice? And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about the injustice that we see in language and the way it affects Black, brown, and marginalized communities. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kimmy. I'm going to introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Dr. J. Rocky Romero. He is the CEO and owner of J.R. Romero and Associates, a training and consultant company he started almost 20 years ago. Dr. Romero is a former assistant professor for New Mexico Highlands University School of Social Work in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He served as the co-chair for Governor Richardson's appointed New Mexico Higher Education Department on Cultural Competency Task Force. He served on the Executive Council for the New Mexico Consortium for Behavioral Health Training and Research. Dr. Romero completed his doctoral studies at the University of New Mexico in Language, Literacy, and Sociocultural Studies. Dr. Romero has been a trainer and consultant for the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC for the last 10 years. His focus is on culturally appropriate treatment while focusing on reducing health disparities for people of color. So I welcome Dr. Romero.
Thank you so much to Anne and PJ, and of course to Kimmy Thank you so much for the groundwork and really laying the foundation for our conversation. I hope that we are able to convey to you all in the next the next 3 series. Part of what I'm really thankful for is, of course, to be associated with the National Hispanic and Latino Mental Health Technology and Transfer Center. And I want to say throughout, and I'll try to summarize at the end, we're available, as Anne mentioned, as consultants for you all that are looking at culturally adapting best practices or evidence-based practices that may not have been researched and developed in your region, but you want to apply a cultural or racial lens to those approaches. We are more than willing to help support that. And we have a list of different trainings that we're able to offer to you all. But I want to thank Anne again and PJ, and of course the Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC for having the courage and looking at the issues that are going on in our communities from another lens that we have to start to speak about. And looking at this work, it's been a long time coming, as many of you know. My work started, just to give you a little bit of background, started in looking at cultural competency and cultural awareness and cultural humility. But then as I got into doctoral studies, it very much gravitated towards race and racial injustices and discrimination and oppression, and looking at things through a critical discourse and a critical discourse analysis, critical race theory analysis, so that we are able to critically look at the language used to create meaning in people's lives, to create access to resources, access to wealth, access to housing and other things. But it also really framed the experience for people of color, and in our case, I'll speak more specifically about Latino people. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Anne, please. So some of the goals that I want to cover today are looking at addressing the use of language as it relates to Latinos, and more specifically starting to kind of, at the end of my presentation, address how that is linked, at least in my mind, to mental health, and more specifically adverse experiences with stress and trauma within our schools and within our communities for Latin adolescents and teenagers and families, of course. So the 2 objectives that I want to cover today, I have a few slides. Just keep in mind, I think I have about 20 slides. I want to spend more time kind of entering into a dialogue in terms of this conversation, because I think as we have more and more of these seminars, we have to continue to have a dialogue. Seeing all the people that have been logging in and saying hello from all over the country and all over the world. I saw someone coming on from India. I think we have to have this conversation and really not jump into healing and jump into how do we start to address and intervene and intervention. I think we have to hear the history a little bit before we get there. So we want to recognize cultural bias, socialization processes, and of course the impact of prejudice through the use of language. And then secondly, how do we improve mental health among our Latino youth, which consists of appropriate language use. Next slide, please. So some historical context. A facet of Latino discrimination that is less known is school segregation. And, I think we have to kind of take a step back to understand kind of this history. We have a long history in communities of color of not only discrimination, but violence. And I can't thank Kimmy enough for having the courage and starting this conversation. And obviously her history of work and commitment to social justice is evident in her description that was given in the introduction. So I thank her for that. This work is not easy, folks. And I think one thing that I want to start with before we just kind of jump into the historical context is really understanding that people of color, and I'll speak for myself and our community that we have conversations with, are tired, are ready for significant change, are tired of being less than and portrayed in media, portrayed in policy, portrayed in access to services as less than, as not needing those services. as being imprisoned in camps that we know still exist. And I just want to bring that back to our attention. How can we continue to sleep well at night knowing that brown children are still held in prisoner camps on United States soil, created through a language of policy and legal discourse, right, that I'll get into in just a minute. So some of the things that we have to understand, and I want to just take just a second to understand from a provider perspective, right? Myself being a licensed clinical social worker, I know many of the audience today being from community-based agencies or more specifically school-based providers and or counselors, etc. So I just want to speak to that just a little bit and understanding the history of kind of where we come from. Understanding I'm in Albuquerque, New Mexico, so no, New Mexico is not in Mexico, formally a part of Mexico, but we are a part of the United States. And it really blows my mind that having those conversations in other parts of the United States, I still get asked that question very frequently. And that goes back to the history and how portrayal in the narrative is created for us by those in power to write the narrative for us, right? So with that said, I want to look at critical self-reflection real quickly before we jump into the historical context, and then we'll kind of get on a little groove here. But I think each of us has to do our homework, and part of what our homework is, at least in my mind, is doing critical self-reflection about what are our biases, and we're going to get into that in some of the implicit bias content, but I think it even starts a little bit before that, right? Understanding where do I come from, where do the people in my family come from. This was a part of my, and I was very fortunate, part of my doctoral studies and dissertation and continued research is looking at how we come to be in racial hierarchies and how racial hierarchies are continued today through the use of language and legal discourse. With that being said, I think we have to understand that the way that people are framed, people of color, and of course, more specifically to my presentation, Latinos are portrayed in certain contexts. Even taking a step back, we have to understand the history of the United States, right? Many of you probably don't know the history because it's not taught in a lot of our public schools, but 1598 started the colonization of northern New Mexico and the United States by Spain and Juan de Oñate. During that time, the practice of encomiendas began, and encomiendas were basically enslavement camps. I think cloaked in this Catholic version of we're coming to save these people being indigenous people or First Nations people. And that doctrine of manifest destiny being enacted in the United States in 1598 through that colonization, imprisoned and enslaved indigenous communities for several decades. Leading into where we saw the racial hierarchy of Spain, the caste system, if you will, replay itself in the Americas. Many people don't know that the first capital in the United States was actually in San Juan Pueblo, formerly Yunque, and is now about 6 miles or so north of Espanola, New Mexico, in New Mexico in the southeast. And that started this whole racial hierarchy and implemented a racial caste system, if you will. Jumping forward to my critical self-reflection was in my research looking at family history, looking at historical documents, baptismal death certificates, church documents, coming to the hard conclusion that my own family had indigenous young lady that was a part of our family. And we have to understand that when you look at a picture and you are indoctrinated into being prideful of colonization, prideful of Spanish and Spain, when you see a picture and you're trying to promote racial and social justices, and a picture presents in your family history and lineage and genealogy that has a photograph of your great-great-grandfather and your grandmother as a baby with a Native American or indigenous young lady standing at the outskirts of the picture, it really puts into context where you come from, and maybe not being so proud of your family's history and how they came to power and they came into where they are today in 2020. So again, critical self-reflection, if we're not to a certain degree uncomfortable in looking at our own family's history, and by no means am I saying we as individuals, as ancestors of you know, our family are perpetrating racism contemporarily, but how are we complicit to how that's happening currently about similar races that may have experienced this historically. So some of the things that we jump a little bit ahead to in looking at this history is 1940s, and until 1946, there being very strict exclusion of Latinos, not only in restaurants and theaters, but in schools. And we see that today also, like I said, where we see these prisoner camps and asylum seekers being put into camps where they're not receiving services, and basic human rights are being infringed upon. And please, the next slide. So with that, again, one case that we want to bring to your attention, and if you even do a quick Google search, the History Channel has a really good history on the brutal history of anti-Latino discrimination in America. And one story that kind of came up with it was, again, 1946, ruled that school districts discriminated against Mexican American students and violated their constitutional rights. And now we see that continuing to happen through some of the immigration rights that are being violated. And again, that would be a whole other presentation, but I think we have to look at that as, how does language continue to perpetuate violence and oppression against certain marginalized groups that have already been marginalized over history? Next slide, please, Anne. So part of what we see a long history of is the language used to describe our students. Latino students were referred to as inferior in hygiene, didn't have the ability or lacked the ability to plan for themselves, so had to be very much taken care of, and almost into, as Kimmy mentioned, into this kind of portrayal of infancy, or they have to be cared for as if they can't care for themselves. And we see that in a long history, even within some of our legal discourse and legal documents that framed and our framing fathers, right, that framed our Constitution. There's still language in there that refers to this, if you're truly looking at that through a critical lens and a critical discourse kind of perspective. Next slide, please. Some of the social determinants of health and some of the perpetration and use or continued use of language that we see is through marginalization. Through legal discourse, certain groups of people are prioritized within policy to have access to resources. Sometimes those policies are then perpetuated when we see the allocation of specifically funding or access to education that is highlighted and identified for those groups that are in more dominance within communities and within regions or institutions that we see. And I'll give a little bit more context to that here in just a little bit. We also see that in the practices of institutions. And you're going to hear me speak a little bit about this when we talk about access to services, when we talk about schools, and some of the most interesting context. And if you're one like me that looks at discourse and looks at language, because again, we understand and we have to know that language matters, right? We have to understand that the language that we use to describe populations, even when we're using the us and them dichotomies, which I'll talk about here shortly, we have to be more cognizant of how we as parts of institutions don't carry out practices. We do as providers, as school social workers, as practitioners. So we have to be a little bit more critical of how the policies that we're implementing and practicing may adversely impact people of color. And of course, like we're talking about in school history, we know that occurs. Daily interactions, we know that some of these institutional racism policies and practices then have kind of the fallout within our daily interactions. And that may be through certain events that we include and exclude certain populations. It may be through microaggressions, right, that we see of some of our faculty or some of our colleagues using against people of color or against Latin communities, where they may be talked about in a certain way. They may be approached in certain language. And we'll talk about certain examples here shortly. Anne, please, the next slide. Some of the racism specifically that we start to look at, again, is through the lens of oppression, anti-immigration laws. We're seeing some of those practices carried out in unfortunately, the current person, Mr. Trump, that holds the highest office in the United States, continues to use language that really perpetuates a certain oppression of certain racial groups. And we hear that when we hear the use of language of thugs rather than asylum seekers. When we hear language of criminal versus immigrants or people immigrating from other countries seeking asylum, right? So we have to really be aware of the language that's used and that we perpetuate, or that we many times turn a blind eye to. But if it's making us feel uncomfortable, and especially now that we're able to get more of these trainings out, anti-discrimination trainings, anti-racism trainings, we start to be more aware, and we start to be more aware of how we can intervene. And I'll say this, white folks out there, we need white allies, and we need people to speak up on behalf of Black people. We need white people to speak up on behalf of Latino populations. And don't get me wrong, we have the voice to speak up for ourselves, but many times, as Kimmy mentioned, you have access to different circles of influence than maybe Hispanic or Latino populations may have at certain points of influence. So we ask for that, and we ask for that support, especially as we look at the third bullet here, policies. So racism can lead to ethno-racial or racial trauma in Hispanic and Latino immigrant communities. And as you guys start to see the language that comes to play, I think it's important that we start to understand how we can intervene in that. And I hope to be able to give you some of those strategies as we move through this series as well. Next slide, please. So some of the mental health disorders, and I think part of how we start to see this is as school personnel, as counselors, school social workers, administrators. We have to understand that sometimes adverse childhood experiences during immigration, through a child's acculturation process in the United States, the language and social experience that they have through social media, through the institutions that they experience, through their experience with the law or with immigration police, etc. We have to understand that starts to create a certain level of adverse childhood experiences that then may lead to mental health symptomatology and or adjustment disorder in certain issues, attachment disorder in certain instances as well. So some of the physical symptoms that typically are reported within schools, at least in my experience, in working in schools and doing school social work, is we hear many Latino young people talk about physical symptomatology, headaches, stomach aches, reporting feeling anxious or uncomfortable, or maybe not having the language to describe that they don't feel welcome in certain settings. And I think we have to be aware of how we label and start to identify that within school settings, not always labeling that as a mental health disorder right off the bat, but taking some time to understand what that acculturation process may be, immigration history may be for that family, and again, how their interaction with social media and social discourse has maybe helped frame some of their perceptions of how they're being treated or how they in their mind are perceiving the treatment that they're experiencing. And I think a lot of times that also for us as Latinos and people of color who are working with other young people of color, at times it's up to us to also validate for young people, right? That gut feeling that they have that, I don't feel comfortable here. when I enter this space within my school or within my community, I feel unwelcomed. I don't feel a part of things. I feel othered, as we talk about, and as Kimmy mentioned, right? Some of the work of bell hooks and othering of people, and especially of people of color. And of course, I think we have to be aware of how that creates certain levels of anxiety and potentially, again, anxiety, depression, and may lead to other attention deficit disorders, etc. And again, we definitely see a high population of young Latinos starting to trend towards the use of substances, again, self-medicating to try to address the symptomatology that they may be experiencing. Next slide, please. So now we start to kind of look at how we have to be aware that institutions, school personnel, and sometimes us as providers, if we're not aware of our implicit bias, we may exacerbate mental health systems. The implicit bias that we may have not done our critical self-reflection work to address may be imperative and be impactful in certain situations. The language matters, as we've talked about. Kimmy laid the foundation for that and did an awesome job. Social institutional discourse. How do we use language in schools, right? How do we capture that we are considering culture and race within schools? I'm sorry to say, folks, but I cringe every time I hear people, especially folks that think that taking a colorblind ideology is doing anybody any good, right? By saying I don't see color is really detracting from the history that a young person that you may be serving, or from the colleague that maybe a person of color may have experienced in order to get to where they are today. So we have to really start to reflect, and if we're using the language, I'm colorblind, I don't see race, I don't see color, you may get yourself into a situation with colleagues of color that may look at you a little strange, and you know, that may be a problem. And I just want to give you a heads up in that sense that do a little bit more around that, right? Georgetown University has some really good work on cultural awareness, on looking at cultural bias. And I think what I would really recommend, and I can work with Ann and PJ to just give you all a list of different resources, books, links that will help in this critical self-reflection that I think we all have to kind of look at. Explicit racism, when we see groups excluded, when we see unfortunately, and I'll share with you guys a tweet that our president retweeted earlier, and it's just taking steps backwards if we're really looking at this through a critical racial lens. And then again, like I mentioned, racial microaggressions. And next slide, please. So implicit bias, a couple of definitions. And what we want to just really use this as a working definition, right, as we explore this, and as this work now gets some traction. People have been doing anti-racism work for decades now, right, with Delgado and Paulo Freire and some of the folks that we reference, and that I'll reference in my presentation as well, and some of the references that I'll share with you all. But it looks like when we, as practitioners, don't look at the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. These cognitive associations could contribute to the dynamics of various social interactions. And I always say this is that at a very basic level, the us and them dichotomy is taught in families at very young ages, right? When we look at, and I always say this, and I hate to say this, but family history and stories and the language that families use are usually the first perpetrator of a separative language that's taught to offspring, right, and to the kiddos and families. Through family history and oral histories and other things, there's usually a separatist type language, us and them. Oh, those people, right? We're different than they are. So I want to just engage that and kind of unpack that here, but engage that real quickly so that as we kind of get into the series over the next 3 weeks, we can really look at that a little bit more closely as well. The second point here, these biases which encompass both favorable and unfavorable assessments are activated involuntarily without an individual's awareness or intentional control. This is where cognitive dissonance comes in a lot of times in this work of critical self-reflection and anti-racism work. A lot of the work that's already been done looks at how human beings present cognitive dissonance when we're facing something that's uncomfortable to us. So when we're facing discrimination or racism in our community, we tend to refer back to things that are more comfortable and turn a blind eye and push ourselves away from that rather than engaging in that and potentially interacting and engaging and intervening in a racial situation. And I hope to talk more about that as we move forward as well. Next slide, please. The implicit bias, again, in summary, concept of unconscious bias is looking at hidden bias or implicit bias that, again, suggests a lot of our social behavior is driven through learned stereotypes, right? Usually within our family system is where these are start and then reinforced once we enter into school systems and institutions as young children. Young children, I don't believe, and I firmly believe this, young children and kids are not born racist. Those are usually learned behaviors. Those are usually language that is given to them and taught to them. And I have not seen studies yet, and I would refer you all to one really good documentary that is I think a good foundation for many people that are maybe just entering this journey is Race, the Power of an Illusion. And there's 3 different segments to that, and if you're not able to find that on the internet or in your local library or school library, let me know and I may be able to get you a copy or access to that, or we may be able to show a certain portion in one of our seminars here. But social behavior is driven by stereotypes, operate automatically usually, and it comes out when we interact with other people, usually in conversations where we don't really understand racial bias, racial discrimination. If we ourselves have not experienced that, sometimes it's hard for us to understand how our biases are potentially perpetuating that in our other interactions socially and professionally. Next slide, Anne, please. So some of the practices, again, that we see are the use of language through discourse, and discourse can be social discourse, the media, newspapers. Now we have Twitter and Facebook and all these other websites that are using language to perpetuate discourse, right? And in many cases that may be of a certain frame of framing certain races within a certain hierarchy and in certain oppressive ways. Sometimes rhetoric continues to oppress people of color and further perpetuating, again, the dichotomy of us versus them. And we have to understand that going even back to 1598 and back to some of the slavery that Kimmy referred to, the divide and conquer strategy is alive and well, and to me is still a legacy of colonization, and it's still very much perpetuated and practiced by, unfortunately, many politicians in our communities today. Some of those examples is perpetuating an us versus them, right? Patriotic versus illegal alien. Rather than saying they are asylum seekers seeking shelter from violence or gang violence or murder, they're illegal immigrants or they're criminal. When we see, again, our president using terms like the protesters on this side are fine people, the protesters on that side, which are predominantly people of color, are violent protesters, thugs. And in schools, when we start to say those kids or them versus our kids or we as a school community, right? Again, so language matters and we have to remind ourselves of that. Next slide, please. Policies that we use. So the use of language and policy matters. It continues the us and them, the theirs and ours. I usually say this, and I won't get into too much of this, but just be aware when you're looking at policies, even if it's within a school policy that's being sent down by your school principal or by the superintendent, look at how those groups within a school policy are identified. Usually groups that are identified first, if it's a policy of policing or if it's a policy of addressing certain behaviors that may be antagonistic to school, behavior or philosophy, usually it's groups of color that are listed first, right? When it comes to allocation of resources, usually groups that are more dominant within certain communities and institutions are listed first. And at times, groups are othered within documents that we have to be aware of. And it's very clearly done, which I can, again, share instances of that as we move forward through this seminar series. We also have to ask ourselves, in certain policies, why are certain racial groups excluded? Even if it's allocation of resources policy, disciplinary policy, behavioral policies, etc. Some of the other things that we look at within school systems, and don't get me wrong, AP and those sort of classes that get kiddos to higher places within college are definitely really, really great. But when they're only allowed, or when we start to see profiling of certain races within those AP classes and others where Latino groups and Latino kiddos are put into more recruitment for the military, or are not promoted for college because right now they don't speak English properly. Whereas in their school and maybe their country prior to immigrating, they were top students, had A's. Yet in the United States, we put them into special education and we classify them as special education students. That, my friends, is institutional racism. And if we don't continue to not addressing that, and again, I think we have to use legal discourse, the class standards, right? Cultural linguistic standards that the federal government put out. Any agency or school utilizing or receiving federal dollars has to abide by class standards. And meaning that they have to provide access to services, behavioral health, or otherwise in the language of the community or the agency or the students that they are serving. So we have to be aware of that and really just, keep in mind how these practices may be very subtle, but they're long lasting and impactful. Next slide, please, Anne. So some of the racial profiling, and Anne talked about, Kimmy talked about this, which I think is extremely important, but racial profiling and discrimination, we see that through some of the unfortunate events that have happened with Mr. Floyd and other people of color over the last several years. Broken window policing. In some instances, we see this within schools as well, where basic infringing upon school rules leads to probation or referral to probation in the courts. And that becomes a part of that child's permanent record in many cases, rather than maybe addressing the disciplinary issue within the school. And again, zero tolerance. And I get it when it comes to violence or gang activity or other things, but when it comes to basic infringement, we had a young person in a school that I was a part of that jumped up in the middle of one of the hallways and broke the ceiling tile in the school. And he was referred to probation and parole. His parents had to take time out of work to go and visit with probation officers, I should say, and get kind of disciplinary action that way. So these sort of policing practices, and now when we start to see more policing in school, or the practice of militarizing our police, we see very bad things happening to young people of color, especially our Latinx communities. Next slide, please. Some of the racial aggressions that we see, microaggressions. I've been told, go back to Mexico many times. Where were you born? A teacher corrects the grammar only of Hispanic children or Latino children. Talking behind the students back to other professionals or students about racial identifiers or stereotypes, but unwilling to speak directly to the student about those. Maybe to help them become a better speaker. Passing notes when a person of color is speaking without giving them your attention, right? So we have to understand that these sort of microaggressions or slights of people of color really builds on this bigger platform of racism, and it continues to perpetuate how language use very much impacts our Latino kiddos in our schools. Next slide, please. again, so I think we also have to see language as a part of the transformative experience. So language can very much be a part of how we heal. If we start to be more inclusive of groups of color, if we start to be more aware of the language that we use, a lot of times we can help groups of color, get through some of the experience that they've had, and really maybe be able to put people of color at the center of this healing and movement forward, and increased awareness and self-reflection. I think also as dominant groups, sometimes we have to be more willing to listen, and to just sit back and hear about the experiences. A lot of things that I hear in transformative language sometimes jumps the gun to interventions, and why can't we get past that? That happened 500 years ago, 400 years ago, 300 years ago. Those are very insensitive words to choose when talking about healing or helping communities of color heal from the oppression and racism that they've experienced. So I think it's important for us to really understand, to be able to listen more, and to be able to allow communities of color to heal from the oppression and marginalization that they've experienced in a lot of our institutions. Next slide, please. So in summary, we need to train teachers on implicit bias, teach social workers, counselors to be much more critically aware, focus some of our cultural competency training on adapting maybe evidence-based models that you're utilizing that may not look at race or take into consider culture. At the Latino Hispanic Mental Health Technology Center, we can help with that. Creating an atmosphere where teachers can identify, discuss, and find solutions for instances of bias. It's really important to create a collegial atmosphere where, as colleagues, you can take your colleague aside and maybe address a microaggression that you heard them say, or something outright discriminatory or racial that you heard them say, and address that directly with them, right? Help them to learn from that, help each other to learn from that. In the classroom, we can use storytelling. We can tell accurate perspectives of history. Many people don't understand or haven't been taught the history that I just briefly shared with you all about the colonization of the Americas, and really take American history from the point of Columbus. And I think that's a mistake that we're continuing to make if we as a country don't really allow people of color, Indigenous, First Nations people, Latino communities to tell their own story. The use of music, books, and other forms of literature, again, like I just shared, and then redesigning classroom dynamics to be more inclusive. We have very much a hierarchy, structural, top-down system within our school institutions. Paulo Freire and his Pedagogy of the Oppressed talks about community-based learning, how we are able and we should bring in people from the community, historians, artists, and people that can also teach young people about their history and about their racial background and ancestry from a firsthand perspective, rather than be removed from books where we have to go search and seek that out on our own many times. Next slide, please. I think that ends it for us. I want to highlight real quickly before I turn it over to our moderator, the new Jim Crow, and Kimmy mentioned this in terms of, and I would be remiss not to mention this, one of the most recent instances, and you can look at Twitter and see it for yourselves, but the Mr. Trump, the person in the highest office of the land, retweeting this tweet today. And I think, again, when we talk about language matters, and a lot of times politicians, namely people that I've gotten to know in my own circles, brush off discourse and brush off Twitter and brush off social media as saying, oh, that's just social media, those things don't matter. Language matters, folks. And when our young people and Latino people and people of color continue to hear these things from the leader of the free world in our communities, and young people hear this of their populations it continues to perpetuate racism structurally as well as directly. So this is coming from Donald J. Trump. I'm happy to inform and I quote, "I am happy to inform all of the people living their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood." Folks, these are direct discriminatory housing practices that have been outlawed long ago. But here we now take steps backwards, right, in our practices, in our legal discourse. And again, when language matters, we have to hold those people that use that type of language or perpetuate or retweet this sort of language or discourse accountable. And I'm glad to see, unfortunately, social media now has been turned against the racist, and I'm happy to say I'm glad to see that many times. It's very hard to see, and I really want to end this with saying, if the last few months have not brought emotion to your heart and tears potentially to your eyes, seeing some of the oppression and seeing some of the things that we've seen, we really have to do some critical self-reflection. And just some of the comments that I heard from some of the attendees today. Again, I'm very thankful to PJ and Ann and the Northeastern Caribbean MHTTC, the National Hispanic and Latino MHTTC, for having the courage to bring these conversations to the forefront, giving us a platform as people of color. Thank you, Kimmy, for allowing me. I'm humbly blessed to have had you as my co-presenter today. I hope we can do some more work down the road together and continue this dialogue. But let me end this again by saying, those of you from dominant groups, white populations, we need you as allies. We need progressive thinkers, and we can't do this alone any longer. Not that we won't do it alone, because we've been doing it alone for a long time as people of color, but we need help, and we need people that are progressive. Thank you again, PJ and Ann, for being progressive in your thinking and bringing us together. With that, I'll stand for any questions or comments, and I'm blessed to be a part of this series. Thanks again.
Thank you both, to Dr. Romero and to Kimmy, for joining us today. We do have a little bit of time for some questions and answers. So if anyone with us today has any questions now, please feel free to type them either in the chat or in the Q&A. There were a couple that came through while you all were speaking. So one that came in, I believe, while you were speaking, Kimmy, but I think open to feedback from both of you, was when you were talking about some of the words that maybe we don't intend to be pejorative, but are, and you were highlighting something that I know educated me when you and I spoke about it earlier, was the use of the word minority. And so there was a question about replacement language. What's a better term to use when you might have previously used minority?
Yes, absolutely. And Dr. Romero, please feel free to follow in right behind me as well. So I'm happy that you asked that question, because I did not circle back to the phrase Black, Indigenous, people of color, or what people refer to as BIPOC, right? So when you use the word minority, you're really minimizing a person's humanity, right? And so if you feel like you need to explain that they are a person of color versus a white person, you can simply say that. You can say a person of color, right? Or you can say a marginalized population, right? But I really like the phrase Black, Indigenous, people of color, because those three categories of populations are each very distinct, right? So people of color have a very different relationship with this country than Black people do. And people of color have a very different relationship with this country than Indigenous people do, right? And so you can use those categories, and that way you're not minimizing a person's humanity, and you're also not using words that might be offensive or using some sort of slang or slur, right? You're much more referring to their ethnicity, or as close as we can get to their ethnicity in this country, right? Because unfortunately, a lot of Black folks have no idea what their ethnicity or nationality is or was originally with their ancestors, right? So you want to use language that's current, and you want to use language that's referring to their humanity as opposed to using the word minority, which is literally just referring to them as a number on a page.
Thank you.
And I'll just add to that. I think Kimmy did a great job in terms of how do you not perpetuate using language as kind of the physical slap down of people, right? And I don't know how to say that another way, but again, using our language to kind of almost keep people down in a minority status. And again,
Right.
I think having the ability to engage, right? We shouldn't be having conversations, if we can at all help it, about marginalized populations without them present, right? Or at least having a voice. And I think in that, asking that group or those representatives, how do you want to be referred? How do you want to be spoken about? Because I think there's ways of saying, you know, even just naming people, you know, Jesse and Joe and Rahim from this community, those are the people most impacted by racial injustices at this time, right? Rather than saying that group of minorities from that community of East Los Angeles or East Los, right? So there's ways I think that we can just use language for the true beauty of language by being more describing of people. And again, I think just asking folks, having the courtesy rather than us having the privilege of labeling people, asking people, how would you like for me to refer to you as a group of people? How do you want to be represented in this policy or in this legal discourse or in this story, right? Or in this lesson plan? I think those are invaluable conversations that we can't jump too far ahead of.
Mm-hmm. So we have two more questions here. Oh, maybe a third one. So we'll see how many we can get to in just the last minute or so. One, I believe is mostly to you, Dr. Romero. The statement is, I noticed you were predominantly using the term Latino and using Latinx less frequently. Can you speak to the use of the term Latinx?
Yeah, I think that's part of the transition that we're seeing in the use of language, right? And I think that's an important aspect for us, and part of, as an institution, as a representative of the, you know, the National Hispanic Latino Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, some of the language that is given to us by the federal government to use also has to be kept into consideration, right, as we're doing these presentations. And at times, I think that that's another aspect of legal discourse and policy that we can, as advocates, address, right, is why, as federal government agencies telling us how to use language, well, historically, that can be very oppressive, right? Now, what we're seeing with the Latinx movement of discourse is the younger population not wanting to be kind of notched into Latina or Latino. So it has to do more with this gender binary, right, that we tend to lock people into as well. And the Latinx population, our younger Latino population, really wanting to present that as more fluid. And I think that's kind of the use that we have to see now, and we even see that within our LGBTQ plus populations, right? The reclaiming of the word queer, whereas one point it was used as a very derogatory and very shaming word. Now certain groups are using and reclaiming that. So we see that a lot within Indigenous populations as well, and I think we have to support that, and we have to be willing to engage, even if it makes us uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right. Well, we're right at 2:30, and I do try and be respectful of people's time and end right on time. So I'm sorry we won't be able to get to all of the questions. I'll see if I can note them down and ask the presenters briefly afterwards, and see if we can get those back out to you, and potentially maybe even address them in one of the subsequent webinars that we're having. So again, I just wanted to offer my gratitude to Dr. Romero and to Kimmy Carlos. Thank you very much for both of your wonderful presentations. We look forward to hearing from both of you in our subsequent webinars in this series, and we hope that those in attendance are able to join us for those other meetings. So thank you again so much, and we hope you have a good rest of the day.